Daniel Hannan, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
We are 6 months almost into a 2-year process which will end with the departure of the UK from the European Union. Are you satisfied with what has happened in those first 6 months?
Yes, I am. I think it's gone better than a lot of people expected. We were told during the referendum campaign that the very act of voting leave would trigger an immediate economic downturn. I don't think anyone now argues that that happened. We grew faster in the 6 months after the vote than in the 6 months before. Whether you look at exports, whether you look at consumer confidence, retail sales, growth, employment, overseas investment, the stock exchange, they're all rising. Britain is in a strong position, and I'm hopeful that we can have an amicable process that leads to a mutually advantageous outcome where there's gains to us, but of course also benefits to our European allies.
Right. Of course, it is a process which is a two-way street. We have wishes, desires, things we want to achieve, say we as the United Kingdom. The Europeans, all 27 nation states still in the European Union and wishing to stay in it, they have their own take, their own concerns on all of this. It's interesting, isn't it, that European politicians seem to be feeling that the process is not working, starting with the negotiators themselves who left the negotiations at the end of July expressing deep frustration with what they believed was the lack of preparedness from the UK side.
I don't recognise that description. I think the government is now making public what was in its private negotiating positions up until now, and they are very sensible, moderate proposals on how to maintain judicial cooperation, how to ensure mutual recognition of goods and services, how to avoid a hard border in Ireland, practical proposals on customs and so on. But I have to say, Stephen, I don't really buy the idea that it's a win-lose negotiation, that we have our desires and the 27 theirs. It is plainly in Britain's interest for the EU 27 to prosper. These countries are our friends and our allies and our trading partners, right? It would obviously not be in our interest, for example, for Brexit to lead to some kind of prolonged bout of uncertainty about the euro, which then affected the prosperity of our neighbours. We want them to do well. So we should go into this process looking for win-win outcomes and for mutual advantages.
Sure, but any negotiation is an exercise in a power dynamic. And surely you would agree that right now the leverage lies with the European partners rather than with the UK. I mean, as Mr. Barnier, the Commission negotiator, keeps reminding us, the clock is ticking. The UK is going to leave in 18 months now, come what may. And it is clear from so many different voices in the UK that we cannot now conceive of leaving with no deal. So we have to do a deal.
I'm not sure why that countdown is considered only disadvantageous to us. Imagine if there was no Article 50, imagine if there was no deadline. Then we really would be in a position where the talks could be strung out endlessly, where continuing financial tribute could be exacted from us, where we'd be completely subject to all EU rules without any hope of getting out. So I think actually putting an end moment on it and saying we are leaving with or without a deal by such and such a date focuses the minds of both sides and makes it more likely that we'll have a mutually beneficial arrangement.
Sure, but I'm talking about leverage and who holds the cards. When people like, for example, the boss of an airline, Michael O'Leary, say that if we leave with no deal, then my planes will stop flying. Or if we have car manufacturers who say, if there is no deal, we simply won't be able to send our components, receive our components from our European manufacturing sites, and our production line will stop. That's the pressure which the United Kingdom has to deal with.
Well, if you really took it seriously. But I mean, there are 27...
these people are telling porcupines
There are 27 countries in the EU. There are 165 countries not in the EU. And you know what? They have airlines and they can fly to each other. We managed to fly to non-EU countries from here. The idea that our planes will be grounded is such an absurd fantasy that it's ridiculous that we're even discussing it as a serious proposition. You know, you don't need to be part of a political union to trade with another country. And actually, I suspect that the trade talks with the EU will be technically the easiest bit of these whole negotiations. There will be some tough talks about the money and about agricultural standards and so on. But the basic idea of a free trade area, remember that these will be the first ever trade talks in history where you've started from a position of zero tariffs and of regulatory equivalence. So for once, the inertia bias is working the other way.
With respect, you are one of the longest-serving Brexiteers I can think of. You know, your voice has been a powerful force inside the Tory party urging withdrawal for a very long time. So you clearly have a vested interest in saying that there is no urgency here, no problem. But let me quote to you somebody who doesn't have such a vested interest or a stake, the CBI Campaigns Director, John Foster, who says this: business needs urgent agreement on interim arrangements to ensure that goods and services still flow freely. Otherwise, he says, we have a profound problem.
And the CBI declared itself very encouraged by the proposals published last week on how the customs union would work. I think once it's clear...
He's talking about urgency. Now, urgency works in favour of the European Union rather than the UK, it seems to me.
Actually, it's in no one's interest for there to be a complete collapse of the talks.
So when Theresa May said, actually, let me stop you right there, because what you've just said is very important. Back in January, Theresa May said in that set-piece speech at Lancaster House, she said, while I'm sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Nobody seems to be saying that. Nobody seems to be saying that anymore.
No, I'm saying that. That is a statement of the obvious. I mean, you know, if you had some kind of deal, some sort of Hunger Games type deal, where they said you have to send us a boy and a girl every year to be sacrificed.
Right, so of course, right. Let's not deal with absurdities.
So, well, no. But it is therefore a statement of the obvious to say there is a point where you would walk away. Now, what I'm saying is that applies to both sides. On the day that we leave, we become the EU's single biggest export destination. Right? It is not in the interest of anyone in Brussels, and I haven't really heard anyone in Brussels claim otherwise, for us to walk away without the basic trade arrangements being put in place.
But sure, there will be arguments about it. The percentage of GDP of the European collective is tiny compared with the percentage of GDP that trade with Europe represents for us. So, in the most crude form, clearly we've got more to lose than they have.
Both sides have an incentive to reach a deal.
But would you accept my premise?
Well, it depends how you measure it. I mean, in percentage terms, of course, it is bigger for the UK than for the EU. On the other hand, the balance of trade is overwhelmingly to the favour of the EU. The EU is selling to Britain much more than it is buying from Britain, and it's not normal in any trade negotiations for the salesman to bully the customer.
Let's get to the detail of what's happened in recent weeks, because I think we can both agree that the British government has shown signs over the last few weeks of being very keen to find a way to coalesce, because there are internal divisions, but coalesce around transitional arrangements that can maintain a positive economic relationship with the European Union after this 2-year deadline has passed. Now, seems to me, looking at the detail, that key concessions have already been made, and I want to know how you feel about them. For example, on the money, David Davis, the Brexit sort of cabinet secretary, he's saying now that, quote, programmes that the UK wants to consider participating in, we will participate in. He has, it seems, sent a signal that ongoing payments will continue to the European Union. That acceptable to you?
I think that's a very sensible idea. I mean, remember that it was a very narrow result. 52% of people voted to leave, 48% of people voted to stay. Now, it seems to me that the only way then to build a consensus is to have not an immediate severance, but a gradual and phased repatriation of power that leaves in place some of our existing arrangements. I mean, whatever we end up with is going to go too far for some, not far enough for others, but we should at least try and build a consensus that is acceptable to most of the 48% and most of the 52%. Now, part of that is remaining part of these various programmes where they are in everybody's interest.
Would that include jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice for a transitional period?
No.
Recognising that jurisdiction?
We would have, I think, and we're working towards an arbitration mechanism such as other non-EU countries in this part of the world have, like the Swiss or the Norwegians or whatever, where you can have mutual applicability of each other's judgments and an arbitration mechanism that takes account of both the ECJ and the other party.
My God, that sounds awfully complicated. But to many
not
people,
really. It's what you do with every other country.
It will sound like we're actually, by the back door, acceding to the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
I've heard people say this, and I think it's really important to stress the difference. The ECJ uniquely can override the statutes, the national internal statutes of a member country, and has direct effect on the territory of a member state. It's the only court of its kind that does that. No one is looking at staying in the ECJ on those terms. What we want is to have a friendly bilateral deal with it.
Isn't this, in a sense, quite personal for you? And I'm wondering how you react to it in a personal way. I mean, you've spent the best part of your adult life, politically, working to free Britain, as you would see it, from the shackles of the European Union. But now we have a government which this summer is sending a message to the public which essentially says, worry not, although we're leaving the European Union and we'll do all the symbolic stuff which involves leaving, actually continuity is the watchword, and we'll keep as much of what we had before as we possibly can. Does that in some ways stick in your throat?
No, on the contrary. I mean, before the referendum, I wrote a book called Why Vote Leave, in which I suggested that it would be a gradual process, that the day after Brexit will look very much like the day before, that's the day that a divergence can begin. It's a day that we can begin to pursue a different trajectory.
Is actually the new status quo. That's the point.
Well, it obviously is in our interest to keep those bits of European cooperation that are working for all sides. So, for example, the basis of the single market, I would argue, is the rule that prohibits discrimination against goods or products from another member state on grounds of nationality. I don't know of anyone in the Vote Leave campaign who argued against doing that. And there are lots of ways in which you can keep that rule either through domestic laws or through bilateral treaties, the way that the Swiss do. It seems to me that where you have sensible things like that, you should keep them.
The problem
Research
is that
programs, educational programs, fine.
The Swiss deal with the European Union, based on the economic free trade area, is a highly complex agreement, and that's a much smaller country than we are. It could take many years to negotiate a deal that's, you know, a British version of what the Swiss have. I know it's something you've always been quite attracted to, but we don't have many years, because even after this transition, the message from the cabinet, including Philip Hammond and David Davis in their joint statement, is that whatever transition we have must be over by the time of the next election, which is going to be 2022 at the latest. So there's very little time here.
Well, I mean, the Swiss managed it in, of course, they're a smaller country, but in a way that gave them much less leverage, because they were, 8 million people rather than 65 million, and they have a surplus rather than a deficit with the EU. But they did manage to sit down and work out on technical issues like fish farming and the permissible noise of lorries or whatever, a deal that is now working so well that almost no one in Switzerland still wants to join the EU. I mean, the issue has just disappeared. Both sides accept that the Swiss have a status where they are largely in a free trade area, but largely outside all of the politics. And I really don't think it's rocket science to do something similar.
One of the most senior members of your party, the Conservative Party, George Osborne, now edits the Standard newspaper in London. He wrote well, I can't say he wrote it, but he put his name to the paper, which wrote a scathing editorial about where the government is taking Brexit just yesterday, in which his scornful conclusion was, Britain is working hard to prove that we can recreate what we already have. You know, what on earth is all this about if, in the end, even your message is, you know what, so much of what we're going through this angst and anguish to get is what we already have.
What we're getting is democracy. What we're getting is the right to make our own laws and to live under our own parliament. And that is an incredibly important thing. What we're getting as a bonus is the ability to trade with other countries around the world, to be a more internationally engaged, more global, more competitive country. But that doesn't mean that you stop cooperating with your friends and allies who are 22 miles away across the channel. It's perfectly possible to be an independent country, to take back control in the sense that British law once again becomes supreme on our own territory, but then to use that control in a sensible way through bilateral or multilateral deals to have working, acceptable arrangements with countries in whose success we still have an interest, because they are our friends, our suppliers and our customers.
I don't wish to flatter you, but you sound so emollient, so reasonable, that one wonders what this difficult negotiation is all about. You make it sound so straightforward. But I am mindful.
I think it may be easier than you think. I mean,
well,
it's your job in the media to find obstacles, but in reality, things tend to go a bit better.
But you know what? Unfortunately, you aren't representative of so much of what is happening.
Some people are emotionally invested in wanting it to fail.
Oh, well, is Boris Johnson invested in wanting it to fail?
Of course he is.
So in that case,
but I think a lot of the people you were just quoting, they were people who campaigned very hard to stay in.
I'm deliberately not quoting your political opponents or rabid sort of pro-EU opinion in this country. I'm trying to focus on the nature of the negotiation today. So let me quote to you Boris Johnson, who told the EU negotiators to, quote, go whistle if they expected to get some say 50 billion euros, some say even more, as part of the compensation package for Britain leaving the Union. Go whistle, is that...
All right, so you've been in this game for a while, right? You've seen lots of these negotiations. What would you expect to be happening at an early stage? You would expect, wouldn't you, both sides to put in a pretty high opening bid. So you'd expect the EU to come out with an unrealistically large figure, and you'd expect the British to say, go whistle. And in the end, we will come...
You know what? I actually wouldn't expect
you wouldn't?
that.
Okay.
I wouldn't,
well,
because this is serious stuff. This is about the future of the United Kingdom. And I wouldn't expect the Foreign Secretary to use that kind of language and that kind of tone, which is more important, in negotiation with the very people who Britain will have to do a deal with. There is no choice.
In the end, on this issue of the financing, it seems to me that the obvious way to solve it is for both sides to accept impartial arbitration, to find some kind of neutral tribunal, maybe some kind of court, and just say to them, look, you work out all the assets, you work out all the liabilities, and we both agree in advance to accept your ruling. And that will take the issue off the table. And I'm sure it will be a lot less than the EU is currently asking for, although it won't be zero.
But if it's not, you're prepared to pay it. If it happens to be 60 billion, you'll pay it.
Of course we will pay our bills. I mean, we're not the kind of country that breaks treaties and walks off without meeting its obligations.
So go whistle was just fundamentally unhelpful.
Well, the figure that the EU was then coming out with, which was what Boris was responding to, even the European Commission has now completely dropped. So I think he was, you know, he was, if you like, he's already been vindicated in the sense that nobody is still asking for 100 billion.
There is a sequencing issue here as well. If you're so sure that everything in the best possible world can be achieved with goodwill and good temper, do you accept that the European position, which is that there can be no meaningful debate about all of these long-term issues of the future trading and economic relationship between Britain and the European Union, none of that can happen until these three key quote-unquote divorce issues have been sorted out. That is the money, the compensation package, the status of the land border, which happens to be between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and the third one, which is the status of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in Europe. Well, you accept that
the first
sequencing,
of those we've already just spoken about, and as I say, I think there'll be some kind of arbitration on the money. On Ireland, this is not just an EU priority, it's a British priority as well. The Irish Republic is our closest neighbour, and of course we all have an interest in wanting there to be peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. We don't want there to be any destabilisation. So that is a British, not just an EU priority. It's not some kind of concession to be talking about that early.
Yeah, well, hang on, but the point is, it's not just about talking about it, it's getting stuff done.
Right.
The new Irish Prime Minister said, we are not satisfied with the progress that has been made so far.
Well, and since he said that, we've come out with, I think, two very practical, workable ways of not having an obstructive land border in the island of Ireland. One is to have, if you like, a kind of, we will enforce the EU's external tariff for it. The other is to build on what's already happening in terms of customs facilitations procedures globally to dismantle the border checks. So, but we've also said, well, even if neither of those is accepted, that we will not impose a border.
Yeah, it's this old message. I began the interview with it. It takes two to make a deal. And the Irish and the Commission and many other European leaders, whether it be on Ireland, whether it be on the British government's rather convoluted take on customs and tariffs in a future deal, the Europeans aren't buying what the British are offering.
So this is really important. On Ireland, we have now said, even if neither of those two schemes, both of which would avoid the need for a hard border, even if neither of them is accepted by the EU, we will still not impose physical border checks. So if there is a border in Ireland, it will not be on our side. But this does lead into the very important question of what kind of trade deal we get with the EU as a whole. You can't discuss Ireland in isolation unless you're also talking at least with some idea of what the eventual customs and tariff arrangements between the EU and the UK as a whole will be. And that's why you can't say this is a completely separate issue that we'll talk about and then we'll come on to the broader one. Likewise, frankly, with the money. I mean, if we're going to put in money, if you like, for the sake of goodwill and to oil the wheels and to have a friendly deal, we also need to know what that deal is going to be. And so these issues are not completely separate. They're going to have to be they're going to have to be discussed in parallel.
You said fundamentally, for me, leaving the EU is about democracy. So let's just concentrate on democracy for a second. Tony Blair, who of course is an opponent of yours, a man who believes Britain is better off inside the EU, he said this not long ago. He said, people may decide that they actually don't want to leave on the terms set out. And there has got to be some way, either through Parliament or through an election, possibly another referendum, in which people are able to express their view. As a Democrat who sees this as fundamentally an argument about democracy in the UK, do you agree with him?
Well, I'm sure he wouldn't have said that if the referendum had gone the other way. Then we hear a very different line from him. But look, there's no evidence that that's happened.
Just answer the question.
Well, there has been a general election since the
democratic case for letting the British people, either in a parliamentary vote or with a direct referendum, have a say when the outline of a deal is done.
The only justification for another referendum would be if it were on a different question. In other words, if there were a substantively different deal from the one that David Cameron negotiated in February of last year. Now, if that were to happen, if the EU 27 were to say, OK, here's a looser arrangement where you can have some sort of associate, then that would be a different... But you know as well as I do that that is not happening. And actually, in a way, it's quite surprising that it hasn't happened. I was sort of expecting the other member states to come
know anything about what's going to happen next, because British politics has proven so unpredictable over the last couple of years. I wouldn't make those predictions.
Both
One thing
sides
I would say,
in advance of the referendum promised to accept the outcome, including Tony Blair and Paddy Ashdown and all the people who are now, and the idea that they would be taking this line if it had gone the other way is you only have to state it for its absurdity to be apparent.
Let's just think one last time about what might happen next. I've talked about unpredictability. One thing that is clear is that your Conservative Party is deeply split on the Europe issue, as split as it's ever been. There are people in it, Anna Soubry's one who's come out in the open, who has said that I would be betraying my principles if I didn't make it clear that country comes before party. She has said that she would, if the hard Brexit option is pursued by her own government, she would leave the Tory party. This could split your party, couldn't it?
I hope all politicians would ultimately put country before party. I mean, if they wouldn't, then they need to ask themselves some hard questions about their own politics.
Which will split your party.
Well, all the parties were split by the referendum itself. And obviously the majority of Conservative MPs voted Remain and a large minority voted Leave. However, I have to say, since the referendum, from the Prime Minister down, the MPs who voted Remain have behaved with exemplary democratic respect. They didn't try and argue the toss. They accepted the outcome of the referendum. They said, if this is the instruction we've been given by the British people, let's try and make it successful. There is, of course, a completely legitimate argument, which all parties will have, about the terms of Brexit and which bits we try and keep and how much we continue to shadow what the EU is doing. Those are all very, very legitimate questions, and we should welcome the input from any interested parties on those things. But the fact of leaving the EU, in other words, of having the supremacy of British law again, that is no longer in question. That was determined by the instructions that we were given by the electorate.
We have to end there. Daniel Hannan, thank you for being on Hard Talk. Thank you very much, Daniel.
I think that what will happen is that almost any, you've seen it in the way the news has reacted over the last year. Mrs. Miggin's cat run over, Brexit. Your neighbour moves house, Brexit. House prices up, Brexit. House prices down, Brexit. Everything is ascribed to Brexit. There will be bumps on the road. Some plaster will come off the ceiling from time to time, and there will be some excitable headlines, but we'll end up in a very, very good place.